The boy's name was Hierocles, and he had been born a slave in Caria, a land of sun-scorched hills and the scent of wild thyme. He had a strong back and a charioteer's hands, but it was his face that had been his curse. He had the kind of flawless, tragic beauty that poets write about and old men pay fortunes for. Now that beauty had brought him here, to a gilded room in the heart of the Palatine Hill, where he was being prepared not for service, but for sacrifice. 2 Syrian eunuchs, their faces as smooth and unreadable as polished stones, worked on him in silence. They bathed him in ass's milk, anointed his skin with jasmine oil, so thick it felt like a second skin, and dressed him in the fine, saffron-dyed robes of a Roman bride. They placed a bridal veil, the flammeum, over his blonde hair, its fiery orange colour, a stark contrast to the pale terror on his face. He was not the first. He knew he would not be the last. But today, he was the chosen one. He was to be married to the Emperor of Rome. The door swung open without a sound, and the figure that entered was not the master of the world, but its mistress. Elagabalus was only 16, but he moved with an ancient, languid grace. He was draped in silks of Tyrian purple so deep they shimmered black in the lamplight. His face was a perfect painted mask of white lead and red ochre. His eyes, lined with black coal, were vast, dark pools that reflected a profound, ecstatic madness. On his head he wore not the laurel wreath of a Roman conqueror, but a towering, jewel-encrusted tiara, from which the symbol of his god, a black, conical stone, was suspended over his brow. He was not a man playing a woman. He was a third thing, a divine being existing beyond the crude binaries of mortal gender. He glided towards Hierocles, a faint smile playing on his rouged lips. He was not looking at the boy as an emperor looks at a subject, or even as a man looks at a lover. He was looking at him as a priest looks at an offering. "The bride is beautiful," Elagabalus whispered, his voice a soft, unplaceable melody. He reached out a slender, ring-laden hand and lifted the veil, his painted fingernails tracing a line down Hierocles' cheek. The boy flinched, but did not dare pull away. To be touched by the emperor was to be touched by a god. It was a blessing that felt like a brand. "Tonight," the emperor continued, his dark eyes boring into the boy's, "you will be my husband. You will beat me as a husband beats his wife. You will show your mastery, and I, your empress, will scream and cry and revel in my submission." He said this not with lust, but with the serene authority of a priest dictating the stages of a sacred ritual. This was not a private perversion. It was a public ceremony. The wedding was to be held in the open, before the senators and knights of Rome, a grotesque parody of their most sacred traditions. Heracles was to be the groom, and the emperor of the Roman world, the living incarnation of Jupiter's power, was to be the bride. To understand the sheer, world-breaking horror of this moment for the Romans, one must understand their reality. Rome was not built on laws or legions alone. It was built on an idea, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It was a rigid, unshakable code of conduct that dictated everything. Central to this code was the concept of virtus, a word that meant more than virtue. It meant manliness, courage, duty, and self-control. It was the quality that had conquered the world. A Roman man was the active force, the penetrator, the master of his household, his slaves, his wife, and his own passions. To be passive, to be penetrated, was to be no better than a woman or a slave. It was the ultimate social and spiritual degradation. And now their emperor, the living symbol of Roman virtus, was joyfully, publicly, and ritualistically embracing this ultimate degradation. He was not just breaking a taboo, he was taking a sledgehammer to the very foundations of their identity. This was not the act of a madman. It was the act of a missionary. Elagabalus was not born in Rome. He was a Syrian from Emesa, the hereditary high priest of the sun god Elagabal. He had been swept to power by a conspiracy of his ambitious mother and grandmother, presented to the legions as the secret, illegitimate son of the beloved emperor Caracalla. The soldiers, hungry for a link to a glorious past, had believed it. And so, at the age of 14, this strange, effeminate boy priest had become the master of the world's greatest empire. But he was not interested in being a Roman emperor. He was interested in being a priest. He had come to Rome not to rule it, but to convert it. His goal was to tear down the old gods, Jupiter, Mars, Juno, and replace them with his one true god, the sun, embodied in the black stone he had brought with him from Syria. And his sexual practices were not mere decadence, they were a form of religious warfare. Every debauched banquet, every sacred prostitute installed in the palace, every wedding to a handsome charioteer was a deliberate, calculated assault on the Roman soul. He was showing them that their ideas of manliness were irrelevant. Their traditions were meaningless and their gods were dead. Only the sun, his sun, with its ecstatic, gender-fluid and orgiastic rites was real. The senators watched, their faces pale with a disgust they dared not show. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, stood with their hands gripping their swords, their knuckles white. They had put this creature on the throne. They were beginning to understand that they had not crowned an emperor. They had unleashed a god, and that god was about to drag their entire world into the fire. The ceremony took place in a wing of the palace that had been stripped of all things Roman. The familiar statues of stern, bearded ancestors had been replaced with Syrian idols of dubious form. The air, usually sharp with the scent of Roman laurel and cypress, was now thick and cloying with the smell of foreign nard and smouldering resins that burned the back of the throat. Senator Cassius stood among his peers, his fists clenched so tightly within the sleeves of his toga that his knuckles ached. He was a man of the old school, a man who believed the Republic had died, but that its soul, the Mos Maiorum, could still be saved. He looked at the scene before him and felt a cold, creeping dread that went deeper than fear. It felt like the end of the world. At the front of the hall, before a hastily erected altar to the sun god, the boy Hierocles stood, stiffly, his face ashen beneath the bridal veil. And beside him, playing the blushing bride with an unnerving, ecstatic sincerity, was the Emperor of Rome. Elagabalus was performing his role with meticulous care. He adopted a high, feminine voice to speak the marriage vows. He allowed Hierocles to place a ring on his finger. He even feigned a modest swoon, collapsing into the arms of his husband, to the sound of dissonant music played on Syrian pipes and drums. For the Romans watching, this was not comedy. It was a vision of hell. It was a ritual of inversion, where every sacred tradition was being turned inside out and defiled. The emperor, the pater patriae, the father of the fatherland, was now the wife of a Carian slave. The master of the world was pantomiming submission. Cassius watched as the senators around him tried to school their faces into masks of polite neutrality, but he could see the telltale signs of their revulsion, the twitching jaws, the pale lips, the cold sweat beading on their brows. They were all complicit. Their silence was their consent. To protest was to have your throat cut by the Praetorian guards who stood, their own faces a mixture of confusion and shame, along the walls. This wedding was merely the opening act in a grand campaign of spiritual demolition. Elagabalus's true objective became clear in the weeks that followed. His god, the black conical stone he called Sol Invictus Elagabal, was still housed in a temporary shrine. This would not do. A god, his god, the one true god, needed a home. And not just any home. It needed the most sacred spot in Rome. Elagabalus ordered the construction of a magnificent temple, the Elagabalium, on the northeast corner of the Palatine Hill, a space that overlooked the entire forum. But he didn't just build a new temple. He began a process of sacred consolidation that struck at the very heart of Roman religion. He declared that no god could be worshipped in Rome except in conjunction with Elagabal. He then ordered the most sacred objects of the Roman faith to be forcibly removed from their ancient sanctuaries and brought to his new temple to serve as mere attendants to his Syrian deity. Cassius was there the day they moved the Palladium. For 1,000 years, this small, shapeless wooden statue of Pallas Athena, supposedly rescued from the ashes of Troy by Aeneas himself, had been kept in the innermost sanctum of the Temple of Vesta, guarded by the Vestal Virgins. Its presence was believed to guarantee the physical safety, the imperium, of Rome. It was an object so holy that no man, save the Pontifex Maximus, was ever allowed to look upon it. Now Elagabalus had it brought out into the daylight, carried in a gaudy procession, and installed in a side chapel of the Elagabalium. He claimed he was performing a sacred marriage, uniting the Roman goddess with his sun god. But every Roman understood the reality. It was a hostage-taking. It was a conquest. Their most ancient protector was now a captive. He did the same with the sacred shields of Mars, the flame of Vesta, and the Great Mother of the Gods. He was systematically draining the spiritual power from every corner of the city and hoarding it for himself, for his god. But the most shocking desecration was yet to come. Elagabalus was not content to simply be the high priest of his god. He intended to be his god's chief procurer. He began to systematically transform the imperial palace from the seat of government into a temple brothel. He scoured the empire for men of exceptional endowment and installed them in the palace halls. He would then wander among them, his face painted, his body swaying, adopting the persona of a common prostitute. He would stand in the doorways of the palace rooms, mimicking the stance of the streetwalkers in the Subura, soliciting passers-by, including his own guards and servants. He would call out to them in a breathy voice, promising them nights of pleasure for a few coins, haggling over his price. He kept a special room in the palace for this purpose, furnished with a simple cot, where he would lie and wait for customers. He would then boast to his companions about how many lovers he had taken and how much money he had earned. To the Romans, this was an act of madness so profound it defied comprehension. Prostitution was legal in Rome, but it was the domain of the lowest of the low, the infames, people who were legally dead, with no rights or honour. For their emperor, the source of all law and all honour, to joyfully debase himself in this way was to shatter their entire social and moral universe. It was a declaration that honour was meaningless, that shame was a source of pleasure, and that the emperor of Rome was the city's chief whore. Cassius and the other senators could only watch, trapped in a waking nightmare, as their world was remade into the image of a deranged boy god, his laughter echoing through the desecrated halls of the Palatine. The banquets were the worst part. For a senator like Cassius, an invitation to the palace had once been the pinnacle of social and political life. Under Augustus or Trajan, it was a chance to engage in reasoned debate, to feel the steady hand of power, to participate in the majestic theatre of Roman governance. Under Elagabalus, it was a summons to a descent into madness. The emperor's dining hall was no longer a place of order and decorum. It was a laboratory for humiliation. The guests, the most powerful men in the world, were forced to become actors in their own degradation. Cassius remembered one dinner where the cushions they reclined upon were not filled with the traditional feathers, but were inflatable skins. Halfway through the meal, on a secret signal from the emperor, slaves would puncture the cushions, sending the dignified, toga-clad senators tumbling to the floor in a heap of flailing limbs and spilled wine, to the sound of the emperor's high-pitched, girlish laughter. This was not simply a prank. It was a calculated political statement. Elagabalus was showing them that their dignity was an illusion, that he could deflate it at will. On another occasion, the courses of the meal were made entirely of wax, perfectly sculpted to look like suckling pigs, roasted birds and exotic fruits. The guests, bound by etiquette, would politely pretend to eat the inedible creations, their jaws aching with the effort of chewing on perfumed wax, while the emperor and his Syrian favourites feasted on the real food. It was a way of saying, "You are not real. Your power is not real. You will consume the illusion I provide for you, while I enjoy the substance." He would serve them food that was all one colour, everything green one night, everything blue the next. A jarring, unnatural assault on the senses. He would have lions and leopards, their claws and teeth filed down, suddenly released into the dining hall, creating a panic among the drunken guests who did not know the animals were harmless. He was a master of psychological terror, using the rituals of hospitality as a weapon to unbalance and disorient the very men whose support he needed to rule. His cruelty was not just theatrical, it was deeply personal. He seemed to take a special, perverse delight in targeting men who represented the old Roman ideal of masculinity. He once invited a famously austere and moralistic senator, a man known for his rigid adherence to the old ways, to a private dinner. The senator, hoping perhaps for a moment of sanity, accepted. He was led not to the grand dining hall, but to a small private room. When the doors were opened, he found himself in a chamber filled with nothing but flowers. He was alone. The doors were barred from the outside. Then, from vents in the ceiling, a torrent of rose petals and violets began to fall. At first, it might have seemed like a decadent but harmless gesture, but the flowers kept falling. They filled the room, first to his ankles, then to his knees, then to his chest. The beautiful, fragrant shower became a suffocating mass. The senator, a powerful man of the Republic, found himself drowning, his lungs filling with the sweet, cloying dust of 1,000,000,000 petals. It was a death of poetic, terrifying absurdity. Elagabalus was not just killing his enemies, he was composing their deaths, turning them into grotesque works of art that served as warnings to others. The emperor's sexual theatre was not confined to the palace. He decided that the Roman people needed to be educated, to be enlightened. He began to stage public spectacles that were not just violent, but sacrilegious. He would reenact the most sacred myths of the old gods, but with a depraved twist. The myth of Leda and the swan, where Jupiter takes the form of a swan to seduce a mortal queen, was performed in the amphitheatre. But instead of a swan, a massive trained goose was used, and it was made to perform the act on a condemned criminal before he was executed. The audience, accustomed to the stylized violence of gladiatorial combat, was stunned into a sickened silence. They were not just watching an execution, they were watching their chief god, Jupiter, being mocked and defiled. He would stage elaborate naval battles in the flooded Colosseum, but the ships would be crewed by choirs of prostitutes, their obscene songs echoing across the water. He was systematically polluting every sacred space, every cherished story, turning Roman culture into a weapon against itself. But his most audacious act was the creation of a shadow government, a parody of the Roman Senate. He established a women's senate on the Quirinal Hill, presided over by his mother, the ambitious and ruthless Julia Soaemius. This was not a council for women's rights. It was a court of fashion and etiquette, a place where his mother and her coterie of court ladies would issue solemn decrees on what style of dress was permitted at court, which lady had the right to be carried in a litter versus a sedan chair, and what kind of jewels were appropriate for each social rank. To the Roman elite, this was the ultimate insult. The Senate, the institution that had guided their civilization for 1,000 years, the bedrock of their political identity, was being mocked by a trivial assembly of gossiping women. It was a declaration that politics was no more important than fashion, that the affairs of state were as frivolous as a debate over the proper application of cosmetics. Cassius could only watch as the entire machinery of Roman power was being hollowed out, its sacred forms filled with a new, corrupt substance. The emperor was not just a heretic, he was a deconstructionist, gleefully taking apart the engine of Roman reality, piece by piece, to see what would happen, and the engine was beginning to sputter and die. The breaking point for the city was not a single act of debauchery, but a slow, dawning realization that the gods themselves had turned their faces away. The Tiber flooded its banks, not with the life-giving silt of a normal inundation, but with a brown, pestilential tide that swept through the lower quarters of the city, leaving a trail of drowned bodies and disease. A famine, born of mismanagement and the emperor's profligate spending on his pleasures, began to stalk the streets. The grain dole, the sacred pact between the emperor and his people, was reduced to a trickle. The faces of the common folk, once filled with a boisterous, chaotic love for their city, grew gaunt and hollow-eyed. Their superstitious fear of the strange Syrian boy god was curdling into a hard, desperate anger. They began to see omens everywhere. A calf was born with 2 heads, a statue of Mars was seen to sweat blood, and the sacred chickens, whose pecking patterns were used to foretell the future, refused to eat. The universe was out of balance, and the source of the imbalance was a painted boy on the Palatine Hill. The whispers of dissent began in the one place Elagabalus could not control, the barracks of the Praetorian Guard. These were not men of senatorial principle like Cassius. They were pragmatic, hardened soldiers. They had put Elagabalus on the throne because his grandmother, Julia Maesa, had paid them a fortune and promised them he had the divine blood of Caracalla. They had been paid to believe a lie. Now that lie was costing them everything. Their honour was stained by their association with this thing. Their families were starving. The city was on the verge of revolt. And more importantly, their own lives were in danger. Elagabalus, in his paranoia and religious fervour, had begun to execute senators and knights on the flimsiest of pretexts. and the Praetorians knew it was only a matter of time before he turned on them. The architects of his rise to power were now plotting his fall. The conspiracy was masterminded by the same woman who had engineered his ascension, his grandmother, Julia Maesa. She was a woman of terrifying ambition and unsentimental pragmatism. She had used her grandson as a pawn to restore her family to the throne. Now the pawn had become a liability. She could see the writing on the wall. The dynasty was in danger of being wiped out by a popular uprising or a military coup. She had to act. She had another grandson, a boy named Severus Alexander. He was the polar opposite of Elagabalus. He was a sober, serious, and thoroughly Romanized youth. He was everything his cousin was not. Julia Maesa began to quietly present him to the Praetorians as a viable, and more importantly, a Roman alternative. She convinced a reluctant Elagabalus to formally adopt his cousin as his heir, a move she framed as a way to secure the succession. Elagabalus, perhaps seeing the boy as a harmless distraction, agreed. It was the deadliest mistake of his life. The soldiers immediately gravitated towards Alexander. He was one of them. He trained with them, ate with them, spoke their language of duty and honour. They began to cheer for him in the barracks, to toast his name. Elagabalus, who had demanded worship but had never earned respect, was consumed by a venomous jealousy. He saw his own creation turning against him. He realised too late the trap his grandmother had set. He tried to reverse his decision. He declared his adoption of Alexander null and void and ordered the boy's arrest and execution. But the Praetorians had already made their choice. When the emperor's agents arrived at the barracks to arrest Alexander, they were met by a wall of shields and drawn swords. It was an open declaration of rebellion. The guard had chosen their new master. The news sent Elagabalus into a panic. The divine mask cracked, and for the first time the terrified 16-year-old boy beneath was visible. He barricaded himself in the palace with his mother, Julia Soaemius, and the shrinking circle of his Syrian favourites. He made a desperate, pathetic attempt to buy back the loyalty of the guard, promising them a donative larger than any emperor had ever paid. But it was too late. Their loyalty was not for sale, not anymore. They wanted their honour back. They wanted their Rome back. The morning of March 11th, 222 AD, dawned cold and grey. The sound of marching feet echoed through the streets of Rome. It was the sound of the Praetorian Guard, the Emperor Makers and the Emperor Breakers, marching on the Palatine Hill. They were not coming to protect their emperor. They were coming to collect a debt that could only be paid in blood. Cassius, in his villa on the Esquiline Hill, heard the distant roar of the soldiers and the answering roar of the Roman mob. A sound like the breaking of a great wave. He knew what it meant. The long, obscene festival was over. The gods of Rome, silent for so long, were finally about to receive their sacrifice. And it would be a sacrifice of unparalleled brutality, a cleansing of the city's soul with fire and steel. The end, when it came, was not a battle, but an extermination. The Praetorians, their faces set like stone masks, breached the palace gates with contemptuous ease. The handful of eunuchs and Syrian courtiers who tried to offer resistance were cut down where they stood, their silk robes soaking up their own blood, their screams swallowed by the roar of the mob that surged in behind the soldiers. Elagabalus and his mother, Soaemius, fled into the labyrinthine corridors of the palace. The place that had been their stage, now suddenly a death trap. They knew the soldiers were not there to negotiate. This was not a coup. It was an exorcism. They found a large, ornate chest, the kind used to store imperial robes, and squeezed inside together, pulling the heavy lid down over their heads. It was a final, pathetic attempt to disappear, to hide from the reality they had created. But there was no hiding from the fury of Rome. The soldiers, guided by servants who had long since grown to hate their masters, found the chest. They did not bother to open it. They simply began to hack at it with their short, heavy swords, the gladii that had conquered the world. The wood splintered. And the screams from within, high-pitched and muffled, were a spur to their frenzy. They pried the lid open, and there they were, the boy god and his mother, tangled together in a desperate final embrace. They were dragged out, their fine clothes torn, their painted faces streaked with tears and terror. They were no longer divine, they were just meat. The soldiers did not grant them a quick death. That was a mercy they had not earned. They were stabbed again and again, their bodies lifted and dropped on the points of a dozen swords. The mob, now a churning sea of ecstatic rage, surged forward. They wanted to participate. They wanted a piece of the vengeance. What followed was a ritual of pure, unadulterated hatred. The bodies were dragged out of the palace, down the Palatine Hill, and into the streets of Rome. The corpse of Julia Suamias, the woman whose ambition had unleashed this plague upon them, was cast aside, left in an alley for the dogs to find. But for Elagabalus, they reserved a special fate. His body, now a mangled, unrecognisable thing, was paraded through the very streets where he had once demanded worship. The same citizens who had been forced to avert their eyes from his debauched processions now pushed forward to spit on his corpse, to kick at his lifeless head. They were scouring the memory of him from their city with the soles of their sandals. They dragged him to the Circus Maximus, the great chariot racing track, and tied his body to the back of a cart, pulling him around and around the arena, a final macabre victory lap in the place of his pleasures. His body was literally eating the dust of his own failures. But even this was not enough. His pollution was so profound that it could not be contained within the city walls. They dragged his corpse to the Aemilian Bridge, and with a final collective roar of triumph, heaved it into the murky, swirling waters of the Tiber. But the river, as if it too were disgusted by the defilement, refused to take him. The body, bloated and light, would not sink. It bobbed in the current, a pale, obscene reminder of his reign. The mob, infuriated, fished it out. They tied heavy stones to what was left of his limbs, a crude anchor to ensure his passage to the underworld. And then they tried again. They threw him into the river once more, but this time they had a final destination in mind. They threw him into the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome. It was the ultimate act of damnation. The boy who had tried to become the sun god, the master of the heavens, was given his final burial in the city's river of filth. He was to be washed out to sea with the excrement of the million people he had tried to rule. It was a perfectly symmetrical end, from the heights of the Palatine to the depths of the sewer. In the aftermath, the Senate, led by men like Cassius, convened in a state of grim relief. They did what the mob had done physically, but they did it legally. They issued a damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Elagabalus' name was to be struck from all public inscriptions. His statues were to be torn down and melted. His laws were to be rescinded. His temple, the Elagabalium, was to be rededicated to Jupiter. It was a desperate attempt to erase the last 4 years, to pretend they had never happened, to stitch the wound in their history closed. The black stone of Elagabal, the source of all the madness, was quietly packaged and shipped back to a mesa in Syria, a piece of cosmic poison being returned to its source. The young, sober Severus Alexander was acclaimed as the new emperor, and a fragile, exhausted sense of order began to settle over the city. But it was an illusion. The city had been cleansed, but the memory remained. Rome had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had worn the painted face of a 16-year-old Syrian priest. The world had not ended, but it had been irrevocably broken. They had survived the god, but they would never forget the monster. The reign of Elagabalus was not merely a historical anomaly, a bizarre footnote in the long story of Rome. It was a symptom of a terminal disease. For a man like Cassius, who lived to write the history of these years, the true horror was not what the emperor had done, but what his success had revealed about the state of Rome itself. How could a civilization that had conquered the world, that had produced men like Scipio and Augustus, that had built an empire on the bedrock of duty, honour, and self-control, have fallen under the spell of a depraved child? The answer lay not in the emperor's strength, but in Rome's weakness. The old gods were dying. The mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was no longer a living faith, but a hollowed-out tradition. A set of rituals performed without belief. The soul of Rome was empty, and that emptiness had created a vacuum into which any new, vibrant, and powerful belief system could rush. Elagabalus was not just a sexual deviant. He was a religious revolutionary. His orgies were sermons. His perversions were prophecies. He was the high priest of a new kind of power, one that came not from the rigid, patriarchal order of the Roman state, but from the ecstatic, emotional, and syncretic religions of the East. These were the mystery cults, the faiths of Isis, Mithras, and Cybele, which were sweeping through the empire. They offered what the old Roman religion could not: a personal relationship with the divine, a promise of spiritual rebirth, and the catharsis of emotional release. What the Romans saw as madness, the Syrians saw as divine ecstasy. What the Romans saw as sexual chaos, the East saw as a sacred merging with the gender-fluid nature of the divine. Elagabalus was trying to drag Rome, kicking and screaming, into a new spiritual age. He was a man grotesquely out of his time, a harbinger of a world that would eventually come to pass, but for which the Rome of 222 AD was not yet ready. His failure was absolute, but the forces he represented were unstoppable. His successor, the good and noble Severus Alexander, tried to turn back the clock. He restored the old temples, reinstituted the old rites, and ruled with a sobriety and respect for tradition that earned him the love of the Senate. But it was too little, too late. The foundations had been cracked. The army, long the guarantor of stability, had become a mercenary force that made and unmade emperors at will. The economy was in a death spiral of inflation and overtaxation. The borders were collapsing under the weight of barbarian invasions. Alexander, the boy who was supposed to be the cure, was assassinated by his own troops after just 13 years on the throne, deemed too weak and indecisive to handle the growing crises. His death plunged Rome into the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year period of chaos, civil war, and near total collapse. The empire was torn apart by dozens of barracks emperors, most of whom ruled for only a few months before being murdered by their own men. In this new world of chaos and uncertainty, the old Roman religion, with its cold, contractual relationship with the gods, offered no comfort. People flocked in ever greater numbers to the Eastern mystery cults. The cult of Mithras, with its message of brotherhood and salvation, became the dominant faith of the army. The worship of Isis, the all-merciful mother goddess, offered solace to the suffering masses. And a new strange religion from Judea, one that spoke of a single, all-powerful God and a saviour who had died and been resurrected, began to spread like wildfire through the slums and marketplaces. The Christians, once a persecuted minority, offered a message of hope, community, and eternal life that was perfectly suited to an age of despair. The seeds of the future that Elagabalus had tried to plant with such violent and obscene methods were now growing quietly, inexorably, in the fertile soil of a collapsing empire. Less than a century after Elagabalus was thrown into the sewer, the Emperor Constantine would have a vision of a cross in the sky and begin the process of converting the Roman Empire to Christianity. The age of Jupiter and Mars was over. The age of the one God had begun. And in this new world, the old Roman ideas of virtus and the mos maiorum would seem as alien as the rites of Elagabalus had once seemed to them. The future of Rome, and of the entire Western world, would belong not to the stoic, self-controlled senator, but to the ascetic, self-denying saint. The gender-fluid, ecstatic priest-god Elagabalus had failed, but he was a grotesque parody of a future that was already on its way. He was a false prophet who, in his madness, had correctly foretold the death of a world. He had shown the Romans that their gods were hollow, their traditions were brittle, and their identity was a fragile construction that could be shattered by a single determined act of will. He had been a monster, a heretic, a degenerate, but he had also been a mirror. And in that mirror, Rome had seen its own terrified, dying face. The horror of Elagabalus was not that he had tried to destroy Rome, but that he had almost succeeded. And in doing so, he had revealed that the eternal city was already beginning to destroy itself.